Hey, it's Jordan with the Young Turks and TYT Politics. I'm here with Jared Beck, DNC lawyer, DNC lawsuit. You are an attorney for the plaintiffs, along with your wife, who's off screen right now, but she'll be joining us. There you are, Elizabeth, co-counsel. So we spoke, I believe, last week, and a lot of our conversation was predominantly on what happened in the courtroom. You were heard, the defense, which is the DNC, was heard. We talked about some of the insane comments they made. I wanted to get a little bit. I wanted to get a little more into the actual legality of it today, where I'm going to fake that I have legal expertise that I don't. So I'm going to be asking you more of the legal end. Before we get into that, I'm an elephant in the room kind of guy, so I'm just going to put it out there. So my comrades over at TYT did a segment last week talking about the lawsuit and what was said. They said some things I don't agree with. Particularly one was, well, donations are donations. The other being, in general, class action lawsuits are generally brought by people, opportunists, what have you. I think what got lost in translation there, to be honest, was they also criticized what the DNC lawyer said. And Michael Shore apologized, but getting to what they said, I don't think it's simplistic, like donations are donations. I think if you make donations, if somebody donates to TYT, for example, and TYT says we're going to take that money and we're going to use it to hire 4 reporters and editors and camera people, which we just hired 12 reporters, commentators, all this, and then they use it to, I don't know, fund some of our travel to Zimbabwe.
Coke binges.
Right. some of our travel to Zimbabwe or something, like that's fraudulent. Right. Could you kind of respond to the donations or donations? What your thoughts are?
Sure. Thanks, and thanks for having me on today, Jordan. Really appreciate it. I'm also a
Hey.
Oh.
I think the real elephant in the room is not what your colleague Shore said, although it did, start off something. I think the real elephant in the room for me is, the Young Turks and a lot of its smaller brethren are part of a nascent media that is different, and people are looking for voices in journalism that is outside the mainstream. And one thing that bothers me is how the Young Turks, and I don't know if it's because you all want to take over that space as a monopoly or what, but kind of bothers me how, and I'm not talking necessarily about you, Jordan, it's basically your boss and the Young Turks in general. They've kind of started going after, H.A. Goodman, Tim Black, Nico House, and some other folks who, as Tim Black pointed out, these guys, they built up their readership on their own. So I think it's a little bit bullying. I think that's the big elephant in the room. I don't want to get too far afield here because I want to keep the focus as much as possible on the lawsuit and the issues that we're talking about. I do want to just build on something Elizabeth said. I think that, I was really upset to see what you had to say about Tim Black, H.A. Goodman, Nico House. I mean, these are folks that have been very strong, independent voices for progressives for a long time. They've been talking about these issues and really speaking truth, with very limited resources. I don't want to belabor the point, Jordan, other than to say I think you owe them an apology. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't have the highest respect for the work that you've done. I know you've been on the front lines in Flint, at Standing Rock, and you've been a real voice for progressives. And I think a lot of the eruption that we've seen on social media over what Elizabeth was just talking about, comes from the fact that people have such high expectations for you and high respect for your work. And so, maybe we can turn this moment, which I think is, there's a lot of bad feelings on both sides right now.
but maybe we can turn this into a moment where progressives realize that we really do have to come together on these issues and report the truth. And I appreciate, again, what you're doing. I appreciate what the Young Turks are doing. I have the highest respect for your audience. I know how critically engaged your viewers are, what independent thinkers they are. And so I just want to make sure I say all that before we get into talking about the lawsuit itself. I think the panel that your colleagues did, was mostly ill-informed. I didn't think the discussion was particularly helpful. In my view, what your colleagues did on their panel is a preview of what we're going to get from the mainstream media if and when this story does hit the mainstream media. And as you know, right now there's a mainstream media blackout. Okay, there's nobody in the mainstream media covering this lawsuit, in spite of what was, I think, a very, very significant hearing that we had on the 25th. You've reported on it. Many others have reported on it. Folks on social media have been absolutely digging through the transcript and analyzing the arguments on both sides, which I think is a wonderful thing, because at the end of the day, this is really the only place in our government right now where I think we're having a serious discussion about the issues of corruption in our government and the issues that really came to the fore for progressives, for Bernie Sanders supporters in the 2016 election. So I think it's a very important discussion we're having. So it makes me very, very happy to see the vibrant discussion that we're having all over the social media, all over the independent media, even if that discussion does get heated at times.
Yeah. I just for the sake of, because I have a lot of questions, I want to.
Absolutely.
We're going to lose people if this goes on for an hour. Just specifically to the donations or donations. What are your thoughts on that? Why donations aren't simply donations?
Right. Well, I mean, the elements of fraud are very, very simple elements. This is an old tort that goes back a long, long way. You have to have a false representation or an omission. You have to have reliance on that false statement or omission. You have to have causation, and then you have to have damages. And I think we satisfy all four elements in this case. And the fact that the money that was paid in reliance on the false representations that were propagated by the DNC over and over again in their charter, the fact that the money can be characterized as donations doesn't make a difference. And in fact, there's a Supreme Court case that's right on point. It's called Madigan versus Illinois. It's a 2006 case, and it looked at the concept of whether the state can bring a fraud action against charities that fraudulently solicit donations. And the Supreme Court was very, very clear, and I believe it was even a unanimous decision, that there's no First Amendment protection that immunizes the charity just because the money that's lost by the plaintiffs are donations rather than, let's say, some commercial transaction where you're buying a product or so forth. So I just don't think it's a strong argument at all that they've made. I think it's there's Supreme Court precedent right on point that rebuts it, and I just don't see how they're going to win that argument.
Right. And before I move on to the next question, just to button up with what your wife had said and you had said, because I don't want to, let it not say anything to that. I'm not really going to get into what happened over the weekend. I've said my piece. I'm not going to keep fanning flames. But in general, I think I've heard some things. TYT wants to censor people or suppress smaller people and all this business. I was a nobody before I joined TYT. And there's very few news outlets in the country that would allow a reporter to interview people, start the interview saying, I disagree with my news outlet, and then have people discredit the news outlet, which you're right to do, I agree, and not edit it. I'm not editing any of this. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not getting into everything else. But I just want to make sure you guys know we're not trying to censor you, people under us, as I'm not, and I certainly know the people I work with are not trying to either. I wanted to ask you, there's a part of this that I read that really was interesting to me. They said the defense, the court would have to define who is a member of the Democratic Party nationwide. There's no national registration for either of the major parties. And so this court would have to determine what it means to be a Democrat and then determine whether the class that the court defined was injured in some way. Correct me if I'm wrong. How I'm interpreting that is, what does it matter? What does it matter of a definition of what a Democrat is? You don't have to be a member of the Democratic Party to donate to the DNC or Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton. So when they were saying that, it seemed like a false equivalency, didn't really have any applicable standard in this case.
Well, so let me put that in context. The way we have brought this case is we've defined three separate classes of individuals that we are seeking relief for through the lawsuit. The first is all people who gave to Bernie Sanders. Now, that doesn't have to be Democrats, obviously. It doesn't have to be members of any political party. The way we've defined the class is that if you gave money to Bernie Sanders, you're in that class. Secondly, we've defined a class of people that gave money to the DNC itself. Okay, again, the loan criteria for that class of people is whether you're a DNC donor. And then third, we brought a claim for breach of fiduciary duty on behalf of people who were registered Democrats at the relevant time. And for that specific class, it doesn't matter whether or not you gave money at all. The only criteria that has to be met is that you were a registered Democrat. Now, interestingly, and I think you just put your finger right on the fascinating position that the DNC has taken in response to that particular claim, is that they are taking the position that there is no such thing, or it is impossible to actually define who is a member of the Democratic Party. And when you think about that, it's a pretty, I think it's a pretty bizarre proposition. We know what it means to be a member of the Democratic Party. I think that's something we can define, because if the Democratic Party is saying that you can't define who's a Democrat, then what are we really talking about here? Again, this is another argument that I put up there in the category of a funhouse mirror argument. Once you try to go down the path that they're putting out there, you're ending up in some really, really bizarre territory. And that's, again, why I think their arguments, and this is another one of them, really lack merit.
Gotcha. I wanted to ask something else. They said, I think there's an impossible showing of causation. I mean, the court would have to find that people who fervently supported Bernie Sanders and who purportedly didn't know that this favoritism was going on would not have given to Mr. Sanders, Senator Sanders, if they had not known that there was purported favoritism. I looked at that and said, what legal or standard are they looking at? Of course, nobody could know definitively anything when you're donating money. You don't know the end result. You don't know. We none of us have a crystal ball, but it seems like they're trying to apply vague standards to kind of muddy the waters a little bit. When you donate to something, you're donating based on what you're told the project is, the initiative is, whatever it is. Of course, you don't know totally what the end result is, but how do you read that part of their defense?
This is a very, very good question, because I think it takes us to one of the reasons that we have this case going, and I think that the case is extremely meritorious, is that the way our political system works as a factual matter is really a direct result of what we saw with the culminate in the Citizens United opinion. Okay, and Citizens United essentially equated the donation of money with participation in the political process. Okay, it's people know this Supreme Court decision as sort of the decision which said that corporations are people, and it basically, some might say, opened the floodgates to money in politics, because it said, look, money is free speech. We can't regulate free speech under the First Amendment. We can't restrict it. So if corporations are donating money to super PACs, let's say, they should be able to donate in unlimited amounts, because that's how they're participating in the political process. So all this is a sort of a long way of saying and responding to your question, which is that when people donate to candidates today, and that goes for all of the millions of Bernie Sanders donors who weren't big corporations, but were, as we all know, regular individuals donating typically $27, they were participating in the political process according to how our own Supreme Court has defined that process. And they were donating believing that they were participating in a fair process that was democratic. I just think that's a fundamental premise that we can't really, I don't see how you can dispute it. Why would somebody throw money away on a rigged election? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you cut checks to a campaign when you know that the very organization that's running the primaries is doing everything that it can behind the scenes to make sure that one of the candidates gets a nomination? It doesn't make sense. And so, at the end of the day, we're talking about bedrock assumptions that I think people have when they are actually going to the trouble of writing a check, participating in the political process. They're paying that money because they believe that they are engaging in a fair and democratic process. And as we know, the primaries were anything but.
But also, what does it really matter if at the time you donated, you had no reason to, you had no fear about neutrality or anything like that, if after the fact you uncover emails or whatever it is that show right. The neutral party was reaching out to media to plant stories against the person you donated to. So it seems like right. The defense is really focusing on what the mindset was during the actual act of donation rather than what was learned after the fact.
And that's an excellent question, too, because this is what I would characterize as a case of fraud primarily by omission. So, most people, they're not following, the news to the detailed point of following everything that Debbie Wasserman Schultz says in the media on any particular day. I know that, we who are, very much either cover, like yourself, you're covering the political process, Bernie Sanders, fervent Bernie Sanders supporters, during the primaries, many of them were certainly hanging on every word that Debbie Wasserman might say. But the average person, I think, in this class doesn't have the time to follow everything. So it's not necessary, in our view, to prove that you were actually specifically relying on statements of Debbie Wasserman Schultz. What is key here is exactly what you put your finger on, Jordan, which is what was hidden from the public, what was omitted from the public, what was concealed from the public. That's what makes it a fraud by omission case. So if the DNC is keeping everything behind wraps about how they're actually functioning and how they're actually running the process, well, that's what we call fraud by omission. And I think this is a classic case of it.
So I'm just putting a marker in for the audience. We're going to wrap this part of the video. We're going to make it into a part 2. We're at 20 minutes now, so I don't want to lose you. So stay tuned for part 2 after this.